cool. All right, welcome back everyone to part 2 of our guest panel of the Millennial Boom training. So we want to appreciate all of our guests that we have on today because we're talking about a few different generalizations and stereotypes that might create some explosions in the workplace. Wouldn't you say, Hans? A little explosion.
That's right. Boom.
So really, we're here to demonstrate how each generation is different, negative stereotypes, and also cooperation in and out of the workplace. Hans and I are here to provide details on how to thrive in life and work. So before we move forward we want to kick off with having Brian answer a question from the previous episode. Hans?
Yeah, let me just say the reason why we're pouring all this energy into that is we want organizations, ministries, companies to be productive, to be profitable, to have alignment, to reach their goals. And the more you have a positive culture where people work together, the more you get your goals accomplished and the more it affects your bottom line, whether your bottom line is money or if your bottom line is ministry. So Brian, a question to you. What are some barriers you've encountered working with millennials?
So I think one of the things that affects whether you're a boomer or a millennial, both the barriers, comes from things like arrogance and even sarcasm. I think one of the things that gets in the way when you have unwillingness to employ empathy, where you're not really putting yourself in someone else's seat, you're just assuming that you have all the answers and the right side of that. And there was a lecturer years ago, an author named Tom Peters, who wrote a number of books, In Search of Excellence and Passion for Excellence and Thriving on Chaos were 3 of his books. Very widely reported. One of his concepts, as he looked around at the best companies in America and found out what were the continual characteristics, he found one was absent. There was one thing absent, and he called it thinly disguised contempt. And you can read it in people's body language at times. I'm listening to what you're saying, but, I'm kind of like, and that contempt, sometimes disguised or thinly, sometimes blatant, is something that really gets in the way. And it happens both ways. If you're not really hearing the other's point of view or willingness to be empathetic. And I remember thinking and helping leaders as I help them develop about the concept of, we all expect the benefit of the doubt. We think everyone should give us the benefit of the doubt. And yet we're not always willing to give the benefit of the doubt to others and try to probe deeper with a follow-up question and find out, what did you really mean? Using active listening and find out if there was a real content to that. So I think that the key for me is trying to bring out the best in each other in so far as giving that benefit of the doubt. And I don't think that's just millennial versus boomer or vice versa. I think that's not an unusual thing in generation gaps. In my generation, I remember a lot of what was echoed in our comments someone made here earlier. I think it's the plague of youth, impatience. I expect it all right now. And I think people were that way when I was your ages as well. So it's not just about being a millennial or a stereotype of this generation or that generation. I think it's pretty consistent. I'll leave it at that, Hans.
I agree. I agree with you, Brian, as well. I think that it's not just about one generation. I think it's about everybody and everyone having empathy as well. Because as I get called, the millennial, it's like realistically, yeah, we each have a generation that we are in. But if we all used our EI a little bit more, emotional intelligence, to understand each generation and get to know them, we wouldn't be having this conversation, really. Everybody would be thriving and working together. There wouldn't be a crazy respect this, do this hierarchy. Because as Hans and I say, we've had a relationship for going on 5 years right now, and we've never had a top-down leadership argument. Nothing we've had disagreements on how we think we should do something, but it's like, all right, why are we going to do it that way? Versus we've always had, like you said, the empathy and be able to step back and say, okay, let's move past this and we'll come back to it one way or another. So I do agree with you in that sense for sure. So, getting to the millennials, we want to ask the millennials a question. And listen, I'm getting some feedback, and the comments have been great to hear all the sides from each generation. So just know that each of you has given valuable knowledge to the listeners right now. So for the next question, let's think about this. So for you millennials, ready? This might sting because you're gonna have some good answers, but what bothers you or even annoys you, right, about the attitudes of your generation or to the other generations? Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts here. I'll try to keep it short.
All
I
right.
would say
sir.
one thing is, and I think it was even mentioned in the last segment, there's kind of this annoyance about technology and our devices, and even the comment, young people are stuck on their phones all the time, and I mean, obviously, I think there's some truth to that, but I also think that maybe there's a lack of willingness to understand what's going on those devices, and the fact that young people are engaging in relationship on those devices, just maybe in a different way than they're used to. And just kind of a general lamenting of the good old days before technology, which is interesting because I was just thinking about the current coronavirus crisis, and imagine this crisis 50 years ago, before we had Zoom and FaceTime and all this technology. Technology's really allowed us to stay connected to each other even in the midst of the crisis. And then one other quick thought that George and Cambria have mentioned earlier is just, it kind of bothers me that there's kind of a general lack of respect for what we have to offer sometimes. And kind of that whole RESPECT thing. We were all young once. Everyone was a millennial age once. And I think maybe it's easy to forget what it was like for you when you were in your 20s and 30s.
I love that comment because we have a picture in our book of me when I was a millennial at my desk working when I was 30 years old, and I've got a coat and tie on. And yeah, you're right. Even us boomers were millennials once upon a time, right, Brian?
Amen.
Yeah, for sure. Cambria, what about you? The question was kind of what bothers or annoys you about the boomer attitudes towards your generation? And again, you can talk about both as well if you want to give both sides.
Yeah. I think for me, probably the biggest thing that bothers me is just feeling like, I mean, it's kind of been voiced even that we are not as hard workers necessarily, and that we cannot be trusted with responsibility, that we don't want to work our way up, that we are just wanting things to be handed to us. That bothers me that people think that way, because I'm actually a really hard worker. I was raised by boomers, but also I just think, just the hi Dad, just feeling like, like misunderstood. I feel like that's such a cliche. We feel misunderstood. I really do often just feel misunderstood. Like I'm looking forward to, I look to boomers for their wisdom and like guidance, but I also think that I should be taken seriously. And I just think kind of the thing that I wrote down was that we don't measure up to their work ethic, which I just think maybe is a little unfair, because I think we are hard workers, and we can be really hard workers if we're given the chance. So
I agree with you. Great thoughts. George, what about yourself?
I agree. I think kind of building off of what she said, I think there's this sort of attitude that we aren't hard workers. I've experienced that quite a bit in my college career. Is the people around me like say that I'm not as hard working, but then they don't look at my life. They don't look at what I've done up to this point, and they just assume because of my generation that I'm lazy, I'm on my phone all the time, but that's just not true. And I try to tell them that, but they just kind of push back a little bit, and they assume that I'm lazy and I'm just making excuses, and that I'm like entitled and I want stuff handed to me on a silver platter. Like that's just not true. I find it more satisfying to work really hard for something rather than get it handed to me right off the bat. So that really bothers me a lot. And especially since I look back at my accomplishments, and I'm very, very young, so there's not a lot of accomplishments, but things I've done, I'm really proud of. And for them to see that as me being lazy or me just not working is really, makes me really bitter and really sad.
Yeah.
Because these first few years of my life are really important, and I need a lot of encouragement. I need a lot of challenge as well. But if I hear stuff like that, it really discourages me. So
no, it makes perfect sense. I appreciate that. So let's move on to the boomers. Okay, I'm going to ask the questions to the boomers, and Brian, we're going to have you respond first, and then Hans, we are going to let you respond as well. Because again, these are probably going to be two different perspectives. But Brian, so what bothers or annoys you about millennial attitudes towards your generation?
I think one would be just the lack of respect that was discussed earlier. I mean, we can feel dissed when people ignore history, for example, and think that they know better, that socialism will work this time. Just because it's never worked before doesn't mean it can't work, because we're better and we're going to make it work this time. So shut up, boomers, and just let us have our way. I get really concerned about that because I am a student of history and I have a lot of passion about the processes we're going through and respect for the way our nation was built and the politics of, probably more than most people. And therefore I am annoyed big time by the ignorance that people don't spend time learning about our history, how our country was founded, how our political processes work, good and bad. But the balance of power that our country was raised on in terms of the check and balance system, improving on the monarchy and staying away from the tyranny of the majority is a truly remarkable accomplishment in history and society. And I fear that we're, as some famous people have said, we're only always one generation away from completely destroying what we have. And I'm afraid that the indoctrination going on in the millennial generation in academia around the country is potentially threatening our existence that way.
I agree.
Powerful. And you know, Will, you and I had a conversation about that about a few weeks ago, about understanding the history, the generations, understanding coming up to know where we came from. And then it's funny because Hans and I talk about that in the book with the great golf of technology and thriving and working together. I mean, that's a huge point. And I agree, Brian. History is number one. We got to know where we came from and how we were started, right? So I agree with that. Hans, what bothers or annoys you about the millennial attitudes towards your generation? Now, before you go, I'm going to say that Hans is not your typical baby boomer, though. So I don't know what's going to come out of his mouth right now because he's not your typical baby boomer, but I want to know. What do you think, Hans?
I'm kind of intimidated because two of my kids are on this panel right now. So they might not agree with what I say. Well, they will agree with the first thing. We're not all technologically illiterate. And we were not a sports family. In our family, we love computers and cars. And so we're a family that loves cars, and all four of our children are tech savvy. So not all boomers are technologically illiterate. In fact, I'm the one that converted Patrick to finally come over to the Mac world, right?
Yes. Yep.
And the other thing is we're not all workaholics. A lot of us care more about our children and our families. And, you know, I think that's a really big deal. And third, we're not all resistant to change. I mean, you know, I'm always been passionate about change. I know I'm an old guy, but I'm not inflexible. We're not all inflexible. So I think that's some of the things that I don't like to be painted with that brush. So that would be my response.
I agree. I 100% agree with you, because if you look at it, each generation is going to have something to say about the other, right? So now we get to the Xers. Hans, do you want to jump in and ask the Xers the questions next, or do you want me to keep
yeah, let me. I was going to read that quote that we read yesterday from Mark Twain. I loved it. All generations are false, including this one.
Who can't agree with that?
So that's one of the passionate messages that Patrick and I have is quit generalizing. All right, so the last question for us, the two Gen Xers, is what would you like the world to know about your generation? I mean, we've heard so much that Gen X feels like they're stuck in the middle. A lot of them are mad at me and Patrick that we didn't even include you guys in our book. It's all about millennials and boomers. So what do you want the world to know about your generation? And Lena, we'll start with you.
So what I would say is that what I see in why there's like a miss or a disconnect or a miscommunication is that we one lack the humbleness and part of our character, and so first seek to understand, then to be understood. And so I think the more we learn what I call like changing your lens of perspective, the more you'll see that there is a bridge to that connection. And so for specifically for Gen Xers is that, you know, the knowledge, and we have knowledge and application. And so we're stuck in between two generations. And then I would say our wisdom and responsibility is to bridge that connection or fill that gap. And we have that opportunity to do that. So, you know, yeah, so I love being stuck in the middle because I feel like I don't see it really as a bad thing because I get best of both worlds, to be honest. So I do love structure, but I also like ambiguity, and so I like to be flexible. You know, I like to work with people, and so and then really seeing how they create and how they work. And so, you know, I think it's really trying to understand other people the best that you can, and then the more that you extend that in your character, the more people will extend that to you as well. So
I love that. You have a positive view that you're the bridge generation. I like that. How about you, Will?
Ever since I met her, that's been her kind of theory on it too. That's ever
like
since
that.
Well, my thoughts are after the boomers are gone, who are the millennials and the IGens going to look towards for guidance? So if they're, you know, I believe that X-gens are trying to preserve history and the millennials are trying to erase it. Abraham Lincoln said, if we don't learn from our mistakes, history always repeats itself. And if we continue down that path, and you know, we're kind of bridging that gap, but at the same time, you've got to ask millennials, okay, when the boomer generation is gone, and us X-gens are, of course, in our 60s and 70s, they need to look towards somebody. Are they going to look towards the future to solve their problems, or are they going to try to solve their problems by looking at the past and what problems that we solved during our generation? So do I feel looked over? Yeah, because we try to give them advice and they won't take it. So it's, you know, it's kind of a bittersweet relationship with me, if that made any sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And I think, Patrick, we're going to throw it open now to open discussion. So we want to just kind of hear whatever else you would like to say, all of you, that hasn't been said, kind of an open discussion for a few minutes. Right, Patrick?
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, Brian, you're going to go first. You want to go first? Someone just chat me so I know to call on next so everybody's not bleeping out, okay? But Brian, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I was thinking back to your comment about emotional intelligence, and it happens to be among the more important things I think that has emerged as more than a buzzword, but an actual thing to think a lot about in the last decade or so, as many books have been written about it. And it all begins with self-awareness. I used to do a little exercise with my kids when we would go on trips, or when I'd be out with one of them somewhere, and we'd get to say the airport, and I'd see some various people, and I'd say, let's read a person. Like, what do you think that person's story is? And particularly when they had a unique look about them. I was in the business of trying to get people to read people. And so I tried it out with my kids, and I'd say, you read books, right? So let's read this person. Because it starts with self-awareness and then reading another person. You can't have empathy, and you can't really have emotional intelligence unless you know exactly where you are, and back to those other things. So I think if there's one thing I would suggest in going forward from all of this, and I really thank you and you both for writing this book, because it's made us think a lot. It's good food for thought. It gets us to step back and look at this, as we all want to be more aware, no matter what the generation. I just can't say thank you enough for providing insight to something that's probably not well enough understood. And if we all just spend more time reading people, we're going to be far ahead of the game.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that for sure. You know, something we and Hans and I promote is when people look at this millennial boom too, again, they always think that we're talking about this, the boomers exploding or being gone, but, you know, we're not. We're just talking about explosions that are happening in the workplace. And having all 9 of us on the phone, on the Zoom call, I could definitely say that there's a lot of explosions on everybody's radar here too. So we got to think how better to thrive in life and work. And I think that if we do that, to Brian's point, we'll learn more about the history. And to Will's point, we won't erase the history. We'll make it better and keep moving forward. Because I agree with one thing is that we don't want to repeat ourselves in history. But I will tell you, when boomers are gone, I will be looking towards our youth for the future. No offense to Gen X or myself or any of my millennial colleagues, but that's what I'll be looking for our youth and in technology and how to preserve, what we're, to live for the next 90, 100, 1,000 years. But Mark, you got a comment. Go ahead, man.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it felt a little weird to kind of throw these jabs at the older generation because I do have a huge amount of respect for boomers, and I just wanted to encourage any other millennials or young people who might be watching this. I have a couple great mentors who are in the boomer and Gen X generation, including my dad, and I would just encourage you, if you're a young person, to listen to the wisdom of boomers and Gen Xers and those older than you. As some have said, history is bound to repeat itself over and over again. And I don't think I would, I think there's a huge value in what we can learn from them. I don't think I would be where I'm at now in life or my career if it wasn't from the wisdom of some of my mentors who are older than me. So that would be my encouragement to you if you're listening to this as a young person, to find a good mentor who's older than you and listen to what they have to say.
Agreed. George, you got a comment?
Yeah, I want to give some hope for my generation. Coming back to the emotional intelligence comment earlier, I think it's definitely something that all generations can gain from. I think millennials recognize that. I can speak from students at Columbia International University. Like, emotional intelligence is something that's widespread. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had at the lunchroom just talking about emotional intelligence, self-awareness, self-management, relational management and awareness, like all that stuff. It's something that millennials are really learning and really wanting to seek advice from generations past. And I think that at least I can speak from my college that it's something that millennials are definitely growing in, and there's hope for my generation.
I love it. What else we got? I know that some of you are sitting on a pin and needle right now, wanting to say something.
Cambria said she had a comment.
Oh, okay. Let me. I think I gotta unmute. Nope. Go ahead, Cambria.
Yeah, no problem. I just wanted to piggyback off of what Mark was saying, because I think some of my best friends and mentors are boomers, and I just think. So when I initially agreed to do this conversation, and then I was looking at the questions you guys sent, I was finding it actually hard to find negative things to say about boomers, because I think there's so much that we can learn from them. And so I think, just as an encouragement to this conversation, is like, any boomers listening, like, we do want to learn from you, and we have so much like curiosity of like what you do know that we don't know, like what I don't know. So like, I just think it's a really this is a really cool conversation. I just want to say thank you to Patrick and Dad for hosting this, and I just think we all can really learn from each other. And I think we have to just remain, I said earlier, just remain curious about each other and what we have to bring to the table.
That's awesome. Love that comment. We've got time for one or two more. Anybody else want to throw a last contribution? This has been rich, right, Patrick?
Yeah, even if you want to share a story, I mean, think about Hans and I put tons of stories in the book while we were doing this because we thought that it would relate to everybody. We didn't want to write a book about someone else's research. So that's why we decided to talk about our baby boomer, millennial, and Gen X experiences. So, I mean, even if it's a story that you think that could be very valuable in helping. I mean, I know I've talked to all of Lena, Will. I mean, I know you've got great stories. I mean, is there anything you want to share about the upcoming generations or even to the baby boomers today?
So I would share one term specifically that I would really encourage us to hold to heart would be value. How are we providing value added? And so we say that definitely very heavily in the corporate sector, but each generation brings a different value, and people have also different ethnic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, faith backgrounds. And so that brings an incredible value to the table, and then also the perspective. And so I think we definitely sometimes miscommunicate the level of respect. You know, if someone's looking at their phone, it may seem disrespectful, or because, I mean, I've even caught myself because I'm from the military background. So when a millennial has said, yeah, but I have also had other generations say, yeah. And so I was taught that that was disrespectful. Like you say yes or yes, sir. And so, so it doesn't necessarily mean that. And so it's really also catching, you know, what maybe was told to us and how our belief system. And so learning how to value other people, I think really speaks of volumes of our own character, but also how we can, you know, work together. And so, and then maybe even speak into some of those stereotypes or the behaviors that we're observing or attitudes. I think it's just being honest, going, you know, do you not care? What does that mean? What are you communicating to me? And they'll go, oh no, you know, my mom's in the hospital. And you're like, oh, that's why you're on your phone. And so it's just such a simple thing to do. And it's really, you know, it's really about who we are in character and how we can connect. But I really encourage us to look at that word value and how we bring value to the table.
Thank you so much, Lena. Thank you, all of you. And again, our passion, we think the best organization, the best company, the best church is made up of people of all generations, right? Working together, all generations, all ages, all ethnicities. So this has just been better than I think we expected. Those of you who are watching with Facebook, would you please hit your share button if you liked what you heard today and share this out. We will be posting this as 2 different Zoom calls on YouTube in the next couple of weeks. But thank you, all of you for being on this panel. Millennial Boom. Let's learn to thrive together in life and work. Goodbye, everybody. Everybody wave.